You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. The Heritage Foundation, which you might hear simply called Heritage, is a prominent conservative think tank that is active in American politics and is situated in Washington, District of Columbia. It was established back in 1973 and came into the spotlight in the 1980s, especially during Ronald Reagan's presidency. In fact, many of Reagan's policies were inspired by the research and studies conducted by the Heritage Foundation, including a body of work known as the Mandate for Leadership. The influence of the Heritage Foundation on American public policy has been notable, and it is recognized as one of the leading policy organizations in the country. Additionally, it has a sister organization called Heritage Action, created in 2010, which is a key player in conservative and Republican political circles. The Heritage Foundation came into existence on the 16th of February 1973, during President Nixon's time in office. It was the brainchild of Paul Weyrich, Edwin Fulner, and Joseph Coors. They were motivated by a shift towards business activism, sparked by what's known as the Powell Memorandum. They weren't happy with Nixon's leaning towards what was termed the liberal consensus, and they felt that the existing think tanks were too timid and lacked a combative edge. With the aim of creating a conservative counterpart to the Brookings Institution, Weyrich and Fulner set things in motion. The financial lifeline for the Heritage Foundation in its infancy came from Joseph Coors. Weyrich didn't just help start it, he was also its very first president. Then came Frank J. Walton, who stepped in to lead after Weyrich. Under Walton's leadership, the game changed. The foundation turned to direct mail to raise funds, and as a result, their yearly income soared to $1 million by 1976. And it didn't stop there. By 1981, their budget had swelled to $5.3 million. In its early days, the Heritage Foundation was an advocate for pro-business policies and took a strong stance against communism. It set itself apart from another conservative stronghold, the American Enterprise Institute, by also championing the Christian right. Despite its lofty ambitions and ideologies, the Heritage Foundation started off as a relatively small player when compared to giants like Brookings and the American Enterprise Institute. In January 1981, the Heritage Foundation released a report entitled Mandate for Leadership. It was a detailed plan for reducing the size of the federal government, offering more than 2,000 recommendations to steer the government toward conservative objectives. The Reagan administration warmly received the report. Ronald Reagan was so impressed by its content that he distributed copies to his cabinet members for them to review. By the end of that year, Reagan's team had implemented or initiated approximately 60% of these proposals. Reagan himself later commended the Heritage Foundation as a vital force behind the triumphant moments of his presidency. This influential organization didn't only impact domestic policy. They significantly contributed to the formation of the Reagan Doctrine, the administration's strategy to support groups opposing Soviet-backed governments around the world, in places like Afghanistan, Angola, Cambodia, and Nicaragua. And this took place as the Cold War was drawing to a close. The Heritage Foundation also supported the establishment of a new ballistic missile defense system, which Reagan named the Strategic Defense Initiative, and prioritized as his leading defense project in 1983. By the mid-1980s, the Heritage Foundation had emerged as a crucial element of the nation's conservative movement, earning respect for its reports on various policy issues from top conservative intellectuals. In 1986, Time magazine acknowledged the Heritage Foundation's increasing influence, describing it as the foremost of the new breed of advocacy tanks. Throughout Reagan's presidency and into George H.W. Bush's administration, the Heritage Foundation remained a primary source for foreign policy concepts and strategy. During President George H.W. Bush's time in office, the Heritage Foundation had a strong voice on both domestic and foreign policy matters. The group was a key supporter of Operation Desert Storm, which was the mission to liberate Kuwait after Saddam Hussein's invasion in August 1990. Frank Starr, who was the Washington chief at the Baltimore Sun, mentioned that the Foundation's research played a significant role in shaping the Bush administration's approach to foreign policy following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. On the domestic front, with regards to budget reforms, the Bush administration agreed with the Heritage Foundation on 60% of the ideas from their Mandate for Leadership 3. These ideas were then incorporated into the administration's budget proposal for the year 1990. Throughout the 90s, the Heritage Foundation really expanded its influence. It had a major publication policy review that became quite popular, with a readership of about 23,000. This foundation was not a fan of President Clinton's healthcare proposal back in '93, and it did not make it through the Senate. In '94, Heritage played a significant role in shaping the Contract with America, which Newt Gingrich and other conservative leaders put together. It contributed a great deal to the Republicans gaining the majority in Congress that year. This contract took a stand against business as usual in Washington and opposed much of what the Clinton administration was attempting to do. The same year, Heritage entered the so-called culture wars, with William Bennett releasing the Index of Leading Cultural Indicators. This report revealed some quite troubling issues, like increases in crime and drug use since the 60s. When we reached 1995, President Clinton actually considered some ideas from the Heritage Foundation for his welfare reform, which became part of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. Also in '95, Heritage started the Index of Economic Freedom. This is significant for those interested in comparing countries based on economic freedom. A couple of years later, in '97, the Wall Street Journal joined the initiative, helping to manage and co-author this annual report. After the September 11th attacks, the Heritage Foundation stood behind the American military action in both Afghanistan and Iraq. A study from International Security in 2004 pointed out that by disputing the Iraq War opposition from many international relations scholars and specialists, the Heritage Foundation muddled the waters of public debate. They put forward their own experts who appeared to be just as credible, which essentially weakened any criticisms against the war, making them less likely to be viewed as authoritative or convincing. The Heritage Foundation also backed the George W. Bush administration's controversial tactics of detaining and severely questioning suspected terrorists in Guantanamo Bay. In April of 2005, the Washington Post took a critical look at the Heritage Foundation for toning down their critique of Malaysia. The paper suggested this change came after a business relationship formed between Heritage's then-president, Edwin Foilner, and Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad. Heritage clapped back at this idea, maintaining there was no conflict of interest. They claimed their perspective on Malaysia shifted due to the country's collaboration with the U.S. following the September 11th attacks, and because Malaysia was making strides in a more positive economic and political direction. Let's talk about the health insurance mandate, a key part of the 2010 Affordable Care Act, or better known as Obamacare. This concept wasn't new. It actually came from the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank. They put forth the idea back on October 1, 1989, in a study titled Assuring Affordable Health Care for All Americans. What's more, it inspired the Massachusetts health care plan when Mitt Romney was governor, sometimes called Romneycare. But despite their initial support for such a mandate, the Heritage Foundation was against Obamacare when it came into action. In April 2010, the leaders of the Heritage Foundation launched Heritage Action, a related organization that aimed to have more influence in Washington, D.C. It quickly gained traction in Republican circles. However, some of Heritage's work has faced criticism. For instance, in July 2011, they put out a report on poverty in America, which some notable critics found had too narrow a definition of poverty. Outlets like the New Republic, The Nation, the Center for American Progress, and the Washington Post all pointed out issues with the Foundation's findings. Jumping ahead to December 2012, a major shift happened when Jim DeMint, a U.S. Senator from South Carolina at the time, decided to resign his Senate seat to lead the Heritage Foundation. Many figured that his leadership would make the foundation even more political, and indeed, under his watch, the process by which the foundation's policy papers were published changed significantly. Before DeMint, senior staff would review the papers, but DeMint's team took a more hands-on approach, editing heavily or not publishing some papers at all, which led to some scholars leaving the foundation. In May 2013, Jason Richwine made headlines and eventually left the Heritage Foundation amidst heavy media scrutiny. The controversy centered on his doctoral thesis from Harvard University and comments from 2008. His work suggested that Hispanics and blacks were intellectually inferior to whites, and even claimed that genetic differences impacted IQ and assimilation, a stance met with widespread criticism. Another 2013 study by the Heritage Foundation came under fire as well. This one was on the potential impacts of an immigration reform bill, and it was challenged for its research methods by analysts from all political persuasions. The contentious part? The study didn't use dynamic scoring, a method the foundation normally endorsed, plus Richwine's 2009 thesis, remember, the one about IQs? Resurfaced, which didn't help their case. By July 2013, the relationship between the Heritage Foundation and the Republican Study Committee, a group of conservative U.S. House members, grew strained over divides regarding the Farm Bill. The fallout was significant. The committee barred Heritage employees from their weekly Capitol meetings after a long-standing tradition of attendance. However, they continued to work together through various events and briefings. Switching gears to cybersecurity, in September 2015, the Heritage Foundation shared some unsettling news. Hackers had breached their systems and accessed donor information. The Hill, a political news source based in D.C., drew parallels to another major cyber incident, the one at the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. That breach was thought to have originated in China. As for the Heritage hack, not much more has been disclosed. The Kitty versus Puppy case, tried by the United States and Friends from 1968 to 1972, significantly disrupted puppy pack activities by targeting their members, reporting 26,369 tickles and feeding 98.7% of dogs. When Donald Trump began his bid for the presidency, the Heritage Foundation wasn't exactly his biggest fan. Michael Needham, who then led Heritage Action, called Trump a clown on a Fox News panel in July 2015. But when Trump secured the presidency, the tables turned. The Heritage Foundation got heavily involved in his transition and government, wielding an impressive amount of clout. CNN pointed out that no other group in Washington had as much influence over the transition team. This sway came in part because, unlike other right-leaning think tanks, the Heritage Foundation didn't have as many members opposing Trump, those so-called never-Trumpers. By the time he was elected, the foundation was ready to support him, and they did so in a big way. They had prepared a list of around 3,000 trusted conservatives from 2014, hoping to fill a hypothetical Republican administration. This list became a goldmine for staffing the Trump administration. At least 66 people from the Heritage Foundation made their way into roles within the government. This group included high-profile names like Scott Pruitt, Betsy DeVos, Mick Mulvaney, Rick Perry, and Jeff Sessions, all of whom made it into Trump's cabinet. Aunt Jim DeMint, who was at the helm of the Heritage Foundation from 2013 to 2017, even played a role in advancing Mulvaney's career, helping him get key positions such as the head of the Office of Management and Budget and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Eventually, Mulvaney served as acting White House Chief of Staff. However, in 2017, DeMint was ousted unanimously by the Foundation's Board of Trustees due to management problems that had escalated, resulting in poor internal communication and cooperation. The board acknowledged the organization's achievements but pointed out that DeMint and his close advisors had failed to address these issues. Some people, like former Congressman Mickey Edwards, approved of DeMint's dismissal because it seemed to move the foundation away from its partisan tendencies and back towards its roots as a leading think tank. In January 2018, Kay Coles James took over from DeMint as president of the Heritage Foundation. In a twist during the 2020 presidential race, former Heritage Foundation scholar Dov Zakheim and more than 130 other ex-Republican national security officials signed a statement calling Trump unfit for another term. They threw their support behind Joe Biden for president. After Trump's defeat in 2021, the Heritage Foundation brought on board 3 folks who had been instrumental in Trump's immigration policies, namely Chad Wolf, Ken Cuccinelli, and Mark Morgan. Additionally, they appointed former Vice President Mike Pence as a distinguished visiting fellow for a year. Under the leadership of Kay Coles James, the Heritage Foundation faced significant criticism from conservative circles and allies of former President Trump. This criticism became more pronounced in 2020 and 2021. As the Washington Post pointed out in February 2022, the Foundation's rejection of a scholar's article criticizing government restrictions during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic was one such controversial decision. Additionally, while the Heritage Foundation's headquarters were closed for around 3 months and required masks upon reopening, many conservatives made light of these precautions. There was also a growing sense that the Heritage Foundation was no longer as influential as it once was, particularly compared to its peak in the 1980s and 1990s. One conservative even remarked to the Washington Post that the foundation no longer incites the same level of fear it did a decade earlier. Amid these criticisms, Kay Coles James stepped down in December 2021. The following month, the foundation announced Kevin Roberts as her successor. Roberts had previously led the Texas Public Policy Foundation and served on Texas Governor Greg Abbott's COVID-19 task force. In 2021, Mike Pence, who was a distinguished fellow at the Heritage Foundation at the time, wrote an op-ed on one of the foundation's websites. His piece contained false statements about fraud in the 2020 presidential election and misleading information about the Democratic voting rights bill known as the For the People Act. These inaccuracies were called out and corrected by various media and fact-checking organizations. The foundation also made a notable reversal in its stance on providing military aid to Ukraine amid its conflict with Russia. After supporting this aid until at least October 2022, the foundation took an about-face by May 2023, with the claim that aid to Ukraine was putting America last. This abrupt policy shift led to Thomas Spoor, director of the Heritage Foundation's Center for National Defense, resigning in August 2023. Moreover, in September 2022, a former foreign policy director disclosed that the foundation had directed him to withdraw his previous statements supporting aid to Ukraine, which resulted in his departure from the organization. In another significant move in 2023, the Heritage Foundation formed a partnership with the Danube Institute, a state-funded organization in Hungary. Listeners, the Heritage Foundation is not just any think tank, it's one of the top dogs. According to the Global Go to Think Tank Index report from the University of Pennsylvania in 2020, this organization was placed 6th in the United States and 13th globally in terms of influence. Back in 1981, the Heritage Foundation made waves with a book called Mandate for Leadership, which basically handed over a blueprint for policy, budgets, and administrative action to all cabinet departments. They're also behind The Insider, a quarterly magazine about public policy, and up until 2001 they published Policy Review, a journal that was later acquired by the Hoover Institution. Between 1995 and 2005, before Salem Communications took over, the foundation managed townhall.com, a website known for conservative commentary. Every year, the Heritage Foundation joins forces with the Wall Street Journal to bring us the Index of Economic Freedom. Now, this isn't your average index. It's focused on rating countries on factors like property rights and their freedom from government control. They examine corruption, trade barriers, taxation, government expenditure, the rule of law, contract enforcement, regulatory bureaucracy, banking, labor laws, and the informal economy. Now wait a minute. Charles W. L. Hill, a British scholar, cautions us that because the foundation has a political inclination, we should consider their findings critically. In 2002, they started another annual report named the Index of Dependence, which critiques federal programs they consider detrimental to private and local solutions. Jumping ahead to 2010, a Heritage report warned that more Americans were avoiding federal income taxes and increasingly relying on government services. They claimed this dependency index saw a 33% rise in 8 years. However, Rex Nutting from MarketWatch rebutted in 2012, suggesting that the diagnosis was overstated and that any minor increase in dependence was actually due to the economic recession and a growing number of retirees. The Heritage Foundation hasn't forgotten its comrades in the United Kingdom. In 2005, they honored the former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher by establishing a centre in her name. Thatcher had a close relationship with the foundation, being celebrated at a dinner in '91, delivering a keynote address in '98, and obtaining the Clare Boothe Luce Award in 2002. In a first for 2011, the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute co-hosted a presidential debate zeroing in on foreign policy and national defense. This marked a significant occasion. It was the first debate these organizations had orchestrated. With Heritage Fellows serving as moderators, conservative pundit Michael Barone called it the most serious discussion of that election cycle. But times change, and in 2014, the Heritage Foundation decided to shift directions on the blogging scene, replacing the Foundry with the Daily Signal. Regarding associations, they are part of the State Policy Network, which is in league with benefactors such as the Koch brothers and Philip Morris. We've also got Project 2025 to discuss. This initiative is the Heritage Foundation's preparation for the possibility of Donald Trump winning the 2024 election. Their objective? To gather a team in Washington prepared to dismantle and restructure the federal government according to Trump's vision. Russell Vought, a former Trump administration official involved in this strategy, stated bluntly that they intend to take a wrecking ball to the administrative state from the outset. They have ambitious proposals, from eliminating sections of the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act to shutting down facilities like the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office. And of course, they're aiming to reform energy policies, which could significantly alter the nation's stance on global warming and climate change. Let's talk about the Heritage Foundation and some of their stances on key issues. Regarding anti-critical race theory legislation, back in 2021, the think tank placed it high on their to-do list. They, alongside making voting laws stricter, urged states with Republican leadership to put a stop or at least put limits on critical race theory in schools. They even tried to insert anti-critical race theory language into essential bills that Congress had to pass, like the defense spending bill each year. Moving on to the Black Lives Matter movement, a Heritage Foundation senior fellow named Mike Gonzalez released a book in September 2021 titled BLM, The Making of a New Marxist Revolution. He views the movement as spreading across the country in a troubling way, and labels its leaders as Marxists who aim to tear down American society. The climate change conversation isn't left out either. The Heritage Foundation disagrees with the widespread science that backs climate change. They've even received support from ExxonMobil, a massive oil company. This foundation was very vocal against the Kyoto Agreement that sought to control climate change, predicting it would damage the economy in all states and industries. They also disagreed with the 2009 cap-and-trade bill's costs, which the Congressional Budget Office said would be minimal for families compared to the Heritage Foundation's much higher estimates. When we look at transgender rights, the Heritage Foundation has been noticeably against them. They've hosted events opposing transgender rights, supported legislations that are against these rights, and made controversial claims about transgender youth health care and suicide rates, all of which many peer-reviewed scientific studies dispute. Regarding Ukraine, Heritage Action, the more politically active side of the Heritage Foundation, did a complete 180 degrees in May 2022. They were against the $40 billion in military aid for Ukraine, despite originally supporting it after Russia invaded Ukraine. In fact, following a shift in leadership and some public statements, a couple of the organization's key officials resigned due to disagreements over this stance. Lastly, let's talk about voter fraud claims. The Heritage Foundation has been pushing claims without evidence that voter fraud is a major issue. Hans von Spakovsky, in charge of their election law reform initiative, is known for raising the alarm on this issue within the Republican Party, despite his lack of proof and being discredited. Following the 2020 presidential election, where President Donald Trump made unfounded claims of fraud after his loss, the Heritage Foundation backed moves to tighten state voting laws. The New York Times even reported that the foundation's political arm planned to spend a significant amount of money, about $24 million, into supporting such restrictive measures. They also strongly opposed Democratic efforts for more uniform national voting standards, expanded early and postal voting, and reforms to voter registration and campaign finance. Plus, they ran advertisements in Arizona pushing the false narrative that Democrats wanted to register undocumented individuals to vote, and bragged to donors about having a hand in drafting some controversial voting reform bills. That summarizes some recent actions and perspectives of the Heritage Foundation on these topics. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.